I was looking forward to this conversation on many levels. One is that I thought I had good practice negotiating as my role as an executive coach. But when we had our two children and one of them was 2.5, I've never had to exercise negotiation nearly as much as I have as a parent.
And they are instinctively fabulous negotiators. And, if you take all the normal expectations, you're much more experienced, you're much smarter, you've got much more power and money, and yet they win. The normal rules don't always work. So, for example, there used to be a real competition between her and her older brother. And each one of them, when there was something, ice cream or whatever, they wanted it. And each one wanted the biggest. And I remember at one point I said, well, you can have the biggest and you can have the hugest. And it actually worked. And I thought, that's interesting, because why in my little mind did I think that there could only be one biggest, 3D negotiation, the people side of the process. That's the tactics, the direct interpersonal interaction. And we think of that as, the at the table piece of the story.
Okay.
And then there's the substantive part. And that's the contents of the term sheet or the contract or the treaty or the memo of understanding or the informal understanding of what we're going to do and so forth. But that's a substance. We call that deal design, and that's the second of the three dimensions. The third, great negotiators do almost instinctively, but that's what you can think of as the setup of a negotiation. When you're going into a deal, have you got the right parties brought into the process in the right sequence, under the right set of understandings and expectations, facing the right set of issues by the right process, and critically, facing the right consequences in the event of no deal? Because a lot of times, even though people don't think about it that way, those are actually choice variables, and you can influence them quite a lot. And what I found, the great negotiators I've studied, worked with, advised, probably, half to 90% of the outcome of a deal has to do with all the stuff you do before you're actually in the room. But I remember being involved in fairly early on in a remarkable negotiation between Guinness and Grand Met that ultimately led to the creation of Diageo. And one of the people involved in that is now one of the wealthiest people in the world, and an extraordinarily tough negotiator. And I just remember thinking, this guy is so smart and so tough and so rich, and I'm a pipsqueak. I mean, I can think, but I don't have any of those assets. And I just remember trying to say, okay, what do we know about this guy? And coming to understand that in many ways, his reputation for winning was critical to his self-image and to his reputation. And is there any way that we could craft where he would not win? Now, we didn't say any way that we could win, but we did see where he might lose and we would lose. And that would be a big blow. Well, could we engineer a sort of a doomsday machine which would lead to a loss on his side? It would to ours too. So in some sense, it was kind of crazy. But that kind of cracked things. And I just remember thinking, there usually are places that you can find. I remember advising a high-tech Canadian headlamp manufacturer that wanted to sell the business to a private equity firm. And there are a few private equity firms and an industrial buyer and so forth. And it was really very, very tough. And the money that we were able to get for this was it was okay, but not great. And it was kind of disappointing. So we really pushed hard. And I just remember kind of thinking, how do we manage to do this? And we finally just said yes to something that was, well better than the alternatives, but pretty shy of what we had aspired to. And I looked at the term sheet, and the term sheet was in US dollars. And we had been negotiating implicitly in Canadian dollars, which were 79 cents to the US dollar. We said, okay.
Wow.
Okay, they were negotiating US dollars. Well, yeah, sure, no problem. And I just remember that told me a lot of things. First of all, no wonder they were fighting so hard, because they were like 30% above what we thought they were in real terms.
Right.
The second thing was, it is not uncommon in negotiation for people to misinterpret aspects of the situation. Lots of times the internal negotiation is as or more challenging than the external ones.
Mm.
And in fact, the way the internal negotiation is organized, it's it often is a big obstacle to doing things externally because there's so many gates you have to go through that the negotiators don't have the scope to create something that would, in fact, on balance, would be much better. And I often, you often say, how well have you mapped the internal process on the other side?
Yeah.
Most like salespeople know they look for the influencers and the decision maker. That's often really way too simple, especially when you're in a cross-border context, because there you might have, a lot of hidden stakeholders. If you're dealing in China, for example, or if you're dealing in Germany or Austria or Switzerland, you have this two-level board, one part of which is dominated by majority by employees. And do you understand what the decision process is? Sometimes it's an autocratic one. Sometimes it's a consensus one. Sometimes it's everybody has to agree. And if you map that, because you're trying to get a decision out of that process, and same thing on your side of the table. I do remember advising somebody who was competing to be a joint venture partner with a Chinese firm. But as you know, in China, it's customary to bring nice gifts to the people you're dealing with. They had in New York gone to Tiffany's and bought a small but very beautiful and elegant crystal clock, and had it wrapped in the signature pale blue Tiffany's wrapping with the white ribbon and so forth, and presented it. And the response really, really horrified, because in China, a clock is a symbol of death. Secondly, pale blue is a funeral color in China. So the whole thing was misbegotten. But stuff like that can, when you hear about, don't show the soles of your feet here or there, or shake with the right hand here or there, look them in the eye or don't look them in the eye. Stuff like that, the kind of kiss, bow, shake hands etiquette can screw you up. I just read Nancy Pelosi's sort of autobiography. It's called The Art of Power, because she's clearly a remarkable legislative negotiator. And yes. I remember watching when Biden said, that's it, I'm running, no question, case closed, only the Almighty could cause me to change. 2 days later, she's on Morning Joe and she says, we're waiting for Joe to decide whether he's going to run or not. And when he does, we will be 100% behind his decision. But that's a really important decision to make. And I'm listening to this and saying, okay, this is interesting. She was born in Baltimore, and her father was a mayor, and then I think he was in the House of Representatives for a while. And he basically said, the only thing you need to do is learn to count. If you've got the votes, you win. So how do you do that? And she has, I put it this way, I'm really impressed, but her secrets are still with her.
That's amazing.
Every time you deal with a challenging interaction, write down what you did, in reflection, what you might have done differently. Keep a deal diary, because sometimes experience just means making the same mistake over and over, and sometimes succeeding, sometimes not. But if you are self-conscious and you do this over time, experience adds up to real increases in capability. Because as you say, if you're a parent, how often do you negotiate? It's daily. And if you think of all the, why with that much daily practice you weren't the equivalent of Olympic negotiator, it's probably because you don't have a means of transforming experience into expertise. And that's a helpful way to do it.
If you enjoy this podcast, please make sure to subscribe. And to stay updated on everything that the Action Catalyst is up to, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Action Catalyst Podcast, and on Twitter at Catalyst_Action. And thanks for listening.